Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning?
Welcome to this very special episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast. I'm Yusuf.
And I'm Mert.
Today, we're deeply honored to have Professor Magda Teter with us, a leading scholar in Jewish studies and history whose work profoundly shapes how we understand anti-Semitism both historically and in contemporary times. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Teter.
We're thrilled.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you.
Thank you.
A very warm welcome also from me. Thank you so much for the gift of your time, and we are excited to learn from you.
Thank you. And I'm excited to hear from you and learn from you.
Professor Teter holds a chair in Judaic Studies and History at Fordham University in New York City. She's the author of multiple groundbreaking books, including Blood Libel, On Trail of an Antisemitic Myth, which won the National Jewish Book Award, and Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Antisemitism and Racism, published by Princeton University Press. Her research offers critical insights into the origins and evolution of anti-Semitic myths and their role as systemic knowledge shaping Western thought.
She currently is the president of the American Academy for Jewish Research.
She has received many prestigious fellowships, including from the John Simon Guggenheim and Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundations, and was Mellon Foundation Fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library.
Her scholarship bridges history, religious studies, and critical theory, making her one of the most important voices today of the understanding how anti-Semitism operates. We are truly grateful to have you here. Welcome, Professor Teter.
Thank you for this very generous and detailed introduction. You've done your homework. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, then let's dive right in.
Yeah. Let's start with the very beginnings. What are the oldest historical traces of anti-Semitism, and is there evidence of anti-Semitism before the rise of Christianity?
Thank you so much. So before I answer your question about the earlier examples, I think I want to say a few words about the word anti-Semitism. And that's a word that is used first in the 19th century, and it was coined specifically to represent a political movement against the inclusion of Jews as equal citizens in Europe, and it was coined in a scientific way to hide really anti-Jewish contempt and anti-Jewish hostility, which was not palatable to modern Europeans like Germans and others. So scholars have been struggling with this word, wondering whether we can use the same word to talk about what we're seeing in the modern period and what we're seeing in antiquity. And so I myself struggle with that word, whether we can use it in this way. But because the word does talk about anti-Jewish hostility, and we can, I think, talk about those earlier examples and help us understand what might be different between the examples from the antiquity and pre-Christian times and what happens later. So obviously there are many examples of anti-Jewish hostility in antiquity before the rise of Christianity, right? Even the biblical texts capture some of that memory, even some Jewish holidays capture that memory of this hostility, whether it's the holiday of Purim, which is based on the book of Esther in the Hebrew scriptures, or whether it is the Hanukkah, which is based on a tradition and extra biblical, that is not a text that is not in the Hebrew Bible. And there were also incidents of violence, such as in Elephantine, Egypt, or in Alexandria, that anti-Jewish violence that is there. So we know that this kind of hostility existed. In my mind, they are different from what we're seeing later with that is embedded in the Christian theology or with Christianity means. They're much more localized. They are much more. They are anti-Jewish because there's a reaction to Jewish types of worship. But there's also a lot of kind of political and local context. There is much less in my mind, or the scholars disagree. Peter Schaeffer has a book called Judeophobia on pre-Christian antiquity. They don't universalize and essentialize Jews like what happens later. So yes, anti-Jewish hostility is for a host of religious and political reasons, and Christianity plays a very important role in the roots and the build-up to what we end up with in modern times.
Could you tell us, where did the narratives that shaped anti-Semitic imagination first evolve? And elaborate on the role Christianity played in which anti-Semitic motives have most persistently been passed down through history?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that is very interesting, I think we can talk about why Jews, who are such a tiny group, I mean, right now there are around 15 million Jews in a world of billions of people, are capturing the imagination of so many people, right? So many people have ideas, whether positive or negative, about Jews, but they exist. But how many people know about other ethnic groups around the world of similar size? So why is that? Why is that group? Is it, some would say, oh, because Jews are all powerful and everywhere, and it's but maybe not. Maybe this is more complex, and this is, I think, where Christianity plays a very important role. So Jews obviously lived in what we today called Israel and Palestine, which was called historically Judea, and the kingdom of Israel split. There are all these sort of ancient history we don't have time to talk about. But they also lived in a diaspora as well, connected. And what connected them was the cult of the god Yahweh that is mentioned in the Bible, and had a shared identity. But when Christianity emerged, it emerged as one of the many sects in Judea and in what was Galilee at that time under sort of Roman rule. And it was really an internal affair. It was a conversation about the messianic expectations, about the type of worship. When we read even the New Testament and the debates that Jesus has that are captured in the text with Pharisees, and they are internal debates that are really happening at the time. And we may not be having this conversation today had this stayed an internal Jewish debate. There may have been a couple of Christian Jewish sects somewhere in, what is today Iraq or Egypt or thing, but we wouldn't be having, we might be talking in the same way as scholars talk about the Samaritans, for instance, right? Also a group mentioned in the ancient texts, but people are not really having global conversations about this group. So what happens is Christianity expands, and it takes whatever issues it has with Jews as it tries to create its own identity, separated from the Judaic identity from Judea and from the Judaism of ancient times. And it's trying to, it creates the kind of contrast. We are not like Jews. we are Christians. And it creates, already Paul, one of the earliest texts we have in Christian, creates a kind of contrasting images and contrasting values. So he associates Christians with faith, with freedom, with promise. And he casts Jews and Judaism with slavery, with earthliness, with flesh, with carnality, right? So creates that contrast. And as Christians are wrestling with that identity, they are embedding the discussion, the discourse about Jews in their texts. And then when they expand into the Roman Empire and beyond, they take these texts with them and these conversations about Jews. And Jews are the kind of the bad guys, the guys who rejected the message, who don't understand the message, who are blind, who are concerned with just like earthly matters, who don't understand the sort of spiritual matters of faith and spirit. So you begin to see this kind of contrast. And then later on, when Christians become a political power, when Roman Empire becomes Christians, they embed that theological hierarchy that it created in law. So we talk about systemic racism, for instance, certainly in the United States, but it becomes a systemic kind of anti-Jewish legislation. So Jews are now on a legal lower level, and we can talk more about it. What are the examples of that now social hierarchy? So I think that Christianity is different, to tie back to our first question, from the earlier examples, because it creates a system of thought about Jews as inferior, as concerned with material matters and flesh and earthly issues, not blind, and it creates also the legal hierarchy that tries to put Jews on the lower level.
You have written a groundbreaking study of the Blood Libel myth that won the International Jewish Book Award. Can you explain what this antisemitic myth was about and how it is influenced anti-Semitic thoughts in centuries that follow?
Thank you for that question. So I think before we get to that question, I think one of the other legacies, because it's tied to the legacy of Christianity, why it emerges in the Christian world. So the ancient Christian texts, such as the Gospels, give us a couple of, aside from the hierarchy that I argue that then leads to the legal and social structures, it also gives us a couple of vignettes that become very powerful in Christian theology, in Christian art, and that highlight Jews as killers of, or as having the role in the killing of Jesus, and that cast the Jews as again the material, the vignette where Jesus expels the money changers from the temple, gives that sort of powerful connection in later imagination with Jews and money, that sort of hostility. So the idea that Jews are plotting against Jesus, that they want to hurt Jesus, becomes this powerful image of Jews as enemies, that they are constantly plotting to do something first about Jesus and then later on also against Christians. So in the medieval period, so over time, the sort of idea that Jews were the killers became really embedded in Christian theology. So in the medieval period, we begin to see the shift in the worship of Jesus as God to the worship and reverence of Jesus as the suffering man. And when you shift that idea from the lofty God who resurrected, who saved the world, to the idea of a suffering man, you begin to think about the passion of Christ, his execution, And you begin to think about these different characters that are involved in this story and also in the then represented in iconography. So at that time, Christians begin to think about the Passion story over Easter and about the supposed role of Jews in the death of Jesus. So you begin to see this trope of Jews as killers of Christ and then emerging. And that's in the 12th century where we begin to see the first accusations, first stories, and then later actual trials of Jews accused of killing Christian boys in place of the Passion of Jesus. So around Easter, which often coincided with Passover, the story began to circulate. The Jews wanted to reenact the crucifixion. So that emerges as the sort of as the idea of Jews as killing Christian boys, and then later on, also something a new sort of doctrine becomes embedded in Catholic and Christian practice of the transubstantiation, which is the turning of the communion wafer into body and blood of Christ. And in that moment, the motif of the blood as this sort of a very important motif for Christians emerged. So Jews were now accused of actually draining the Christian children of their blood for their use. So that became a very powerful story that then with the area of print, the first mass media became spreaded in Europe. But how it plays itself out now today is it plays itself now in the iconography of anti-Israeli cartoons, for instance, that are showing in this the Israelis, but as caricature Jews of killing Christian Palestinian children. So not just in acknowledging the violence in it, but actually turning the language and that caricature of Jews as killers into this contemporary conflict in that way. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the role the conflict plays because that's what your podcast is about. But that's how that iconography and that image is playing itself out today. And the reason why it's so popular currently in the Middle East, because it enters from Europe into the Middle East in the 19th century through the colonial Christian media and propaganda, and then, of course, also through the Nazi propaganda, which plays a role in the 20th century.
Speaking of the 20th century, could you give us a historical outline up to the 20th century that shows the persistence and evolution of central anti-Semitic motives, painting a picture of what persecution looked like?
So there are a couple of these anti-Semitic motifs that I mentioned. The Jews as killers, which we discussed. The Jews and money, which I touched on, but I'm happy to discuss a little bit more. And then the third one is the Jews as the ever-powerful, controlling the conspiracy theories that are played. They all have deeper roots, but they become manifested in modern anti-Semitism in kind of new ways with mass media and other ways. The persecution. So that accusation we just discussed. In several cases when Jews were accused of killing these Christian children, who may have drowned or who may have disappeared, or sometimes they were not even bodies; they were just stories. Jews often were arrested, attacked, and sometimes executed. Sometimes mass violence would occur in the 13th century during the mass Black Death. Jews stories of conspiracies that Jews were responsible for the mass epidemic were circulating in Europe and resulted in mass violence and really ended in many places the existence of the history of Jewish communities in those towns. The synagogues were razed. Jews were either killed or expelled. So there were really the scholars in modern times termed this type of violence as exclusionary violence. So sort of it showed Jews that they don't belong and that they should be eliminated from these Christian communities for that Christian purity. And that violence was seen as this redemptive act of purifying the community, whether for sins of the past as the kind of sacrifice. So there was this violence, but there were also other ways of a persecution or for making Jews, reminding Jews that they are the inferior, that they are the ones that God punished for their sin of rejection of Jesus in this way. And that was what I talked about earlier in the legislation of prohibiting Jews from in some places from owning land, prohibiting Jews from building new synagogues, prohibiting Jews from hiring Christians in order to preserve that social hierarchy, and then marking Jews as Jews, so to prevent the social contact, confining from the 16th century on, confining Jews in ghettos in which the Christians held the key. So Jews could move in and out of the ghetto during the day, but they had to be confined in the ghetto, creating this very clear hierarchy and a clear sort of marking of Jews as an inferior other. And then whenever Jews were successful, they were seen as arrogant or insolent and as having too much money or power or too much influence or doing things that they were not allowed to be done. And that comes from that theological notion, the Christian theological notion that Jews are inferior, that they are punished, that they should, through experience, understand that they are punished by God.
Historically, Jews have been accused from both the right and the left, often tied to conspiracy theories about Jewish power. Can you elaborate on how these conspiracy myths developed and persisted?
Yes, that is a very important question, and again, one that ties into these vignettes from the Gospels, some of the Christian texts, right? So the Jews is plotting to kill Jesus. Christian texts then use some of the a couple of verses in the Hebrew scriptures that Jews are killers of prophets. So that idea that they are conspiring to do that also enters Islam. The idea that Jews are killers of prophets, that they conspire to kill Prophet Muhammad, and that so that sort of builds up, and the idea that Jews have power and are manipulating right behind the scenes is coming from this idea that they should be inferior because they are punished by God. But of course, they are inferior not because of their abilities, but because they are supposed to be punished. So the idea is that they are conspiring to go around all those restrictions that are imposed by law or theology on them to go around and free themselves up from that punishment. So these tropes of Jews as conspiring come into play, and that idea that they have power is really stemming from these concepts of Jewish inferiority. theological and legal inferiority, and that they, whenever they try to get out of that, they are seen as having too much power. So when in modern times Jews become citizen after centuries of exclusion, right? There were laws that prohibited Jews from holding public office, from being judges. There were laws that prohibited intermarriage. There were all kinds of that prohibited Jews from having Christian servants, for instance. So when Jews are suddenly equal citizens, they can be elected officials. They can have any job any citizen could have, right? They can hire whom they whatever want. And that begins to be seen as Jews having too much power and too much control, because there were centuries, a millennium and a half or more, of the imposition of these laws that kept Jews in their legal inferior space, right? And again, that translates also to the Islamic world, because Jews and Christians were in that legal inferior position. So when you have that kind of demand of equality, it seems like they have too much. So they are suddenly seen in places where they were previously not seen. They might be ministers. They might be government officials. They might be in the parliament. They might write for newspapers. They might be owners of newspapers. They might have businesses that are influential. And this idea that whatever Jews have is not their own is embedded in that Christian theology that they should experience that punishment. And by the way, the idea that Jews are exiled from their land is also part of that theology as punishment. So that resistance to Jewish state is also embedded in that. And again, we can perhaps get back to it.
We previously mentioned various anti-Semitic motives, but was there any awareness before modernity that anti-Jewish sentiment was morally wrong? And if yes, what was the language for that?
This is a fantastic question, because the difference between the pre-modern and modern period, the pre-modern period of these social and religious hierarchies, and the modern period of at least legal equality of people as citizens, means that in the modern period, discrimination on the basis of religion, religion, race, or gender, and other things is illegal. Right? These creating legal boundaries. If I want to hire someone, it's like, no, I can't. I don't want to hire them because they are Jewish, or because they are Muslim, or because they are women, or whatever they want, is illegal, because we're supposed to be equal before law. In the pre-modern period, law enforced these boundaries. Right? You were Jewish or you were Christian. There were legal systems. You could do certain things or not certain things. You were prohibited from socializing together, right? You were prohibited from living in certain places. So these boundaries were sanctioned by law in the pre-modern period, but were seen as discriminatory in the modern period. So that's why it was not more like, of course, keeping away from Jews or keeping Jews in lower was morally and legally allowed and sanctioned. So now suddenly, when you have equality, the whole world is upside down, right? The hierarchies are upside down. So these Christians who had been used to what we now would call discriminating Jews and excluding Jews as a normal thing, now they are told this is illegal, and Jews are saying, you can't do this, this is against law, right? So there is this really a clash and conflict, and that's when we have the rise of nationalism, saying like Jews are outsiders, they don't deserve the same rights as we, Germans, French, or others. And we see kind of different reconceptualizing of that Jewish exclusion and inferiority. And again, people don't feel that this was morally morally wrong because they had been used for centuries to the fact that was desired to discriminate, to exclude, and to remind Jews of their place. So that's the big difference. And then, of course, the Holocaust really really ends that acceptability of anti-Jewish anti-Semitism in the post-war era, because we realized where that hostility and that rejection of equality and that reminding Jews that they don't belong can lead. It can lead to mass murder, and in very, very short time, right? In a rapid time.
What is the difference between Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism? And how did the Spanish blood laws contribute to the development of anti-Semitism as a form of biological racism? Could you elaborate on the significance of that history? Sorry.
Yes. So, as we talked at the beginning, the scholars have been grappling with this. Like, can we talk about, anti-Semitism? Are the ancient Jewish, ancient Christian texts anti-Semitic or not? So many scholars have begun to think about different ways of talking of different kinds of anti-Jewish prejudice. So anti-Judaism is regarded by many scholars. I agree with that classification of prejudice against Judaism, that is against Jewish religion or concepts of Jewish religion. And I would say this is banning Jewish synagogues, for instance, might be or treating Jews as inferior because of their religion, might be anti-Judaic. But anti-Jewish would be against Jews as people, right? And David Nirenberg, a scholar that I know you are aware of, and his work aware of, distinguish between anti-Judaism as something that has nothing to do with living Jews, and he talks about anti-Semitism as something that impacts Jews. I think I distinguish between anti-Judaism that is related to, again, Jewish religion and the image of Jews related to religion, and for the pre-modern period, I would tend to use anti-Jewish hostility when it applies to Jews as people who are experiencing it, and then anti-Semitism. I'm struggling with that, but I think I would use that in the modern period when it has real kind of political ramifications about inclusion in political process and with political rights, citizenship, in that kind of way. But anti-Judaism is linked to Judaism, and that, of course, you cannot treat these separately, right? Many Jews today, but historically were observant of Judaism and the religion. So, of course, these are connected, but there might be a different way of hostility, like the trope of Jews and money, for instance, might not be anti-Judaic, but may be anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic in modern times, in that kind of.
We've talked about racism and anti-Semitism previously. Could you elaborate and share your views on how anti-Semitism and racism are historically interconnected? And is anti-Semitism simply one form of racism, or does its much longer history and specific dynamics make it a distinct form of discrimination?
That's a good, and that reminds me that I didn't address the question about Spain, right? So the Spanish laws, so Jews lived for centuries in Spain, and then in the 14th century, culmination in 1391, was a mass violence, examples of mass violence against Jews, and many Jews at that time converted. And then there were subsequent waves of conversion. And in 1492, the remnant of the unconverted Jews were expelled or converted and lived as secret Jews or not secret Jews but Christians in Spain. So Christians in Spain were concerned with heresy, and they distinguished between old Christians and new Christians. And old Christians were the old sort of traditional Christians, and new Christians were the converted Jews. And they began to look at heritage in whether. And they issued laws called purity of blood, limpieza de sangre laws, of looking at the heritage of people for jobs or for positions and or marriage. And some scholars argue that they created sort of blood and racialized hierarchy that connected Jewishness and to biology. There is a difference between, I think, the modern racial anti-Semitism, which emerges really from the Enlightenment era debates over race and racism and the invention of the idea of race, because that is still linked to religion, even though it is hereditary. The heresy becomes hereditary, but it still is within the framework of religion, and it also draws on other notions of heredity, like the aristocratic heredity, right? If there was an aristocrat who wanted to marry a peasant, that was not allowed. That sort of polluted the line. So it wasn't just about Jews. There were all kinds of earlier versions of that sort of heredity. But in the modern period, with the Enlightenment, the time when people are thinking of equality for all natural rights, Europeans are also engaged in transatlantic slave trade. And they are enslaving Black Africans. And here are these like European philosophers talking about these lofty ideas of equality, natural rights, and all that stuff. And yet there's this massive slave trade going on. So they started thinking about the difference. And it's like, well, why can we? And some of the philosophers actually invested in these slave trading companies, right? And they began to create ideas of race. That is, they created Blackness as a race of people that are naturally suited to slavery. But with Jews, that racialization of Jews as Semites goes back to religion. So from the 17th century on into the 18th century, Europeans, as they colonize and engage with the rest of the globe, are beginning to write books and examine the religions of other peoples. And they, of course, see themselves as superior, right? The Christianity is the superior religion. And they look and they write about how, Indians are these, they worship idols, and there are these snake charmers, and they go to Africa and they say there are cannibals there, and there are worshiping animals and other things. So they create this idea of primitive religions and enlightened superior religion. But they always start with Judaism, but they start with Judaism not of the people, of the Jews among whom they live, but they start with Judaism of the Bible. And what do we have in the Judaism of the Bible? Well, we have animal sacrifices in Jerusalem and beyond, right? We have all these kind of so they begin to connect. And of course, where is it? The temple was in Jerusalem. in what Christians called Palestine, or Holy Land, right? So they place Jews in Holy Land, Palestine, and say they are from over there. They are these Orientals, non-Europeans, primitives in that kind of way. So they begin to see Jews not as their neighbors, European Jews. We're talking about Europe because obviously Jews lived all in the Islamic world and in Persia and India and other places. So we're talking now about Europe because anti-Semitism is really modern anti-Semitism is a product of the Western world. And they say, oh, they're not European. They are inferior. They are, they are primitive. They are the other. They even publish like books of comparing Jewish practices and, they read in the Bible with Indian practices and, East India. So that's the racial hierarchy that emerges in the Enlightenment era. Europeans and Christians on top, and then other religions and racialized in that way in that I mentioned. But there's also a different and deeper root of hierarchy. And that is one that is often forgotten in the study of anti-Semitism, is that it's not just the sort of theological ideas about Jews and in Jesus and all that thing that we've discussed earlier, but it's also that systemic legal hierarchy, right? That I mentioned earlier, laws that prohibited Jews from serving in public office, that prohibited Jews from buying property or owning this or that. That is very much linked to the systemic racism we think about, which is embedded by law. And many of the laws that are then applied to Africans and then African Americans, certainly in the United States, are copying the laws that were in place for Jews for many, many, many centuries. So there are these connections. So I think when we think about racism, and I think what we think about anti-Semitism as well, we should think about the relations of power and power dynamics and modes of exclusion in that way. And that's where we see these connections between anti-Semitism and systemic anti-Semitism and racism, and that kind of exclusion, sense of inferiority, rejection of equality, and belonging and struggle. So that I call it in my book Christian Supremacy, using the word supremacy as a very technical form for laws and power in that way, not the kind of skinheads thinking that they are superior as white people, but more in a very technical, structural way.
You've just mentioned the concept of Christian supremacy, which you spoke about in your book. Could you elaborate it a little further for our listeners?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the idea of Christian supremacy, again, I was trying to understand. I was not satisfied with lots of scholarship on anti-Semitism that wasn't really explaining both the durability of it, right? On the one hand, like it is not just a modern phenomenon. There is anti-Jewish prejudice, violence, and hostility before that. And I couldn't accept that just an idea of, from Gospels that paints Jews as responsible for Jesus' death somehow leads to the Holocaust, to that exclusion from the modern world. So I was very unsatisfied with the books about definitions, about that. It was not letting me understand that. And when I started working on anti-Black racism, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, I realized that there's an idea of power, contempt, and superiority and inferiority in that way, and that just as we talk about systemic racism, I realized that there was this legal aspect of that it's not just about theology or imagination or kind of personal contempt for Jew. Oh, I don't want to, hang out with Jews. I don't want my daughter to be married to a Jew. That kind of personal bigotry, but that there was this systemic thing. And that's where I saw the shift from Christian supersessionism, which is a theological terms for Christian superiority, and a replacement of Judaism as a true religion by Christians, to Christian supremacy, that is Christian power and Christian rule of law, that puts Jews in a lower legal position. And then I was able to trace that, how it manifests itself in society and social structures, and how it then impacts the debates over whether Jews deserve to be equal citizens. And Christians in Europe argued that they didn't. And when I was reading about anti-Black racism, I was struck by the same language that was used about why Black people shouldn't be admitted to equal citizenship. And I was wondering, why is that Jews were not enslaved? The two peoples had very, very different historical experience. So why are there such parallels? And the reason is that the language, in the case of anti-Black racism, the status of enslavement and enslavement of Black people led to this concept of their inferiority, that they don't deserve anything because they are naturally inferior. And in the case of Jews, the centuries of laws that treated them as inferior and enslaved to Christians, actually there's a language of slavery that's used in Christian law and Christian theology in relation to Jews, even though they are not enslaved, created that sense of deserved inferiority. And that's where I see these conceptual connections, despite the different historical experiences, in that way. And again, Iberia and Spain come back to it because they are the region where slavery persisted when elsewhere in Europe it was no longer in place. It was also the first region that engages in slave trade. And they have these legal concepts of exclusion, inferiority, and that proto-racialization that you asked about earlier. So there are these very deep connections, even though then later on they kind of go in parallel ways.
What would you say is the most important current form of anti-Semitism today?
This is a tough, but there is a continuous exclusion and violence against Jews that sometimes that comes from the right, and has been there from the right for at least since the late 18th and 19th century, but that is also coming from so-called the left in the movement to support Palestinian rights and in relation to anti-Israeli actions and sentiments, right? And that is not to say that criticism and protests against the state of Israel for its policies and for what it does are anti-Semitic. But that is to say that some of the forms of attacks on Israel or criticism of Israel, or are using anti-Semitic tropes. We talked about the killing of the children. It's not that Palestinian children are not killed, but that caricature, that notion of Jewish power and Israel's power, the idea that you need to get rid of Israel to save the world from whatever. These attacking synagogues of Jews in various places, that is the spillover, that hostility against Israel and its actions that spills over against Jews. And it also manifests itself in ways of exclusion, where there is a litmus test whether Jews can be included if whatever their relationship to the state of Israel, right? So their inclusion is conditional. Oh, if you have friends in Israel, then I'm not going to be talking to you, or you are not invited to this club, or this kind of way. That's the spillover, right? But that traditional right-wing violence and exclusion has not gone away. But we are returning to this notion that Jews, again, from whichever side, do not belong in all spaces in that as other groups.
You just mentioned tropes and anti-Semitism in a way that expresses itself towards Israel. Could we further elaborate how anti-Semitism expresses itself around Israel or within anti-Zionist discourse? And do you see any continuation of said historical tropes and patterns in these contexts?
Yes. So one thing is the idea whether Jews deserve a state, right? And that is something that is that some people challenge, and they think that this is not a problem because of what Israel is doing. And I see it more of a continuation of the discourse that Jews were punished by God for their sin of rejection of Jesus, and were therefore expelled. And we see it throughout Christian texts, from antiquity to the modern times. And that they only will be able to return to their land if they convert, and that will prompt the second coming. That idea of exile, I think, is very powerful in the rejection of the legitimacy of the Jewish state. I think the idea of a state as a manifestation of political rights and power is there, but then also Israel having power and enacting this power in all kinds of ways feeds into this idea of Jewish power that we talked about, that Jews have too much power, that they don't deserve to have that power, right? And it takes away from the criticisms of the policies of the Israeli government that is conducting war or whatever it is, right? Because it kind of broadens the question and universalizes the question about whether Jews deserve that, or whether Jews do this, or whether Jews do that. So these older tropes feed into some of the anti-Israel protests, and I think it is very important to try to disentangle that, and to be very specific on that. And I always say to my students, I cannot tell you what you think, but I can help you think it through. So if you are opposing, let's say, the state of Israel, ask yourself why. Oh, it's because of what they do. So enumerate what it is. If you are opposing the existence of the state of Israel, also ask yourself why. Are there any other states whose existence we question and whose right to existence we question, right? If there are, then maybe it's very specific. One ends up saying, well, it's only the state of Israel that has no right to exist. Then one has to drill deeper. Why is that the only state that I am opposing, right? And in what way I am opposing. So that's the way to disentangle between some kind of sometimes unconscious prejudices against Jews from legitimate criticism of the conduct of the state of Israel as a political entity in the modern world that has the tools of the state and military power, and think about that way.
In Germany, there is much controversy about the definition of anti-Semitism. Could you explain the differences between IRA, Jerusalem, and Nexus definition? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each? And can any definition fully capture the complexity of the nature of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it's really a great question. And I am going to send you in the chat a link of comparison of these things, which you can share with your audience. But it really comes down to what forms of it really comes down. The controversies come down to the question of Israel, right? Whether criticism of anti-Semitic of Zionism or Israel are anti-Semitic, and in what way. And some definitions are much vaguer. The IRA is a little vaguer. The Jerusalem declaration issues more detailed examples of what can't constitute, and the disagreements really come in between the Nexus, the IRA, the Jerusalem one, in the way what's included, what's not included about the state of the criticism of the state of Israel. They all agree that not all criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic, and not all protests against the conduct of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. But they also outline that some of them are, right? So one way to do it is to look at these things, and I send you that chart, and look at these texts, and just, I think, one can come up with one's own, looking at the other ones, chart, and saying, this is what I think works in this way. But I think I would urge to get away from the debates about definitions and think about what anti-Semitism or what anti-Jewish hostility does, right? Even what anti-Israeli hostility does. Does it mean that you will not, if somebody is hostile to Israel, that they will not talk to an Israeli person, regardless of what their political views might be? That is exclusionary. That is not just part of a legitimate criticism of policies, because that excludes the person on the basis of their passport, right? In the same way that we would say, oh, I'm not going to be talking to a German because of what the Nazis do, right? I'm just going to exclude that. And it's like, well, but I might have a different view of that, or I might be, prejudiced. So excluding someone and erasing someone because of what passport they hold, where they were born, is discriminatory and is so I would really urge to kind of think of what it does, rather than the difference. Is this anti-Semitic? Is that kind of criticism anti-Semitic? But rather, if I am saying, remember those memes and the protests with the Israeli flag in the trash can, and let's clean the world. Well, there were Nazi discourse of cleaning the world from Jews to save the world. There are these. So when we're looking at these very broad, general things, I think that is that is where my where my red flags are going. And the other thing is, in terms of that, like the moral question, we all have connections, personal connections, whether through friends or family members, to this part of the world that is causing everybody to get emotionally charged. And what I always ask myself to think about whether I am protesting, whether my kind of emotional response is coming from some moral principles, or whether it's my partisan principle, my partisan connection, or personal connection, emotional connection, is I try to imagine exactly the same situation, but in reverse side. And if I feel exactly the same way, if I imagine that situation reverse side, then I feel that I'm coming from my criticism with my objection from a moral place. If I don't feel the same, but I cheer for one side, but I'm appalled if the sides were reversed, that means that I'm coming from a place of emotional connection and not from a moral principle. So I always try to check that myself for biases to see whether they're, and inevitably we're all connected emotionally to other things, but to disentangle that way, right? So that's where I would go with that.
To follow that up, would you say that your historical work or anti-Semitism research is more generally based on these definitions when identifying historical forms of anti-Semitism?
I would say that my work is actually a reaction to these debates about anti-Semitism that don't get us anywhere, but people start debating about the definition and not what it does. So again, what I am interested in is I'm interested what it does. And the thing that is interesting in the scholarship about anti-Semitism, which is very different from the scholarship on racism, is that the scholarship on anti-Semitism focuses on the anti-Semites or on the people who are thought to be anti-Semites, what they say, what they do. We dissect the images, we dissect the language, we dissect the tropes. But if you wanted to read something, you would never learn anything about Jews and how they are affected by it. What is missing is the people about it. You learn about the caricatures, but you don't learn about the human beings who are behind the caricatures, right? This is not the same in the scholarship about racism, which is about what racism does. It's the impact of racism on the people whom racism targets, right? We think about how people of color feel when they see caricatures of that. We think about how racist laws or microaggressions against people function and impact the people. We never talk about how these discourses on anti-Semitism impact Jews. We never ask Jews how they feel about being portrayed as killers of Christian children or as these demons, ruling the world. We never the human element of Jews as individuals, as human beings, is gone, even in scholarship that aims to combat anti-Semitism. So that's why I would apply the same principles we apply to thinking about other forms of bigotry and racism, Islamophobia, other forms of prejudice, and apply it also to Jews, right? Because Jews are, after all, a minority. We were talking on a global scale, but also in anywhere else they live. And think about how does it if Jews are a successful minority, if there are Jewish elected officials, why are we kind of not happy about it? But when we have official people elected from other groups, we are happy that they are overcoming the prejudice in that kind of way, right? So why is that different? So I would think about the humanity, the human beings behind those categories to help us think through and see what you are guys doing of seeing and trying to grapple with these issues and seeing real human beings behind it.
What do we know about this history of anti-Semitism outside the Western world?
That's a great question because, again, the Western world, how do we define the Western world, right? So traditionally, again, the kind of concept is very much shaped by Western European Christian ideas of superiority and power that comes in the early modern Enlightenment era and beyond. I would also include the Islamic world and the Western world because it comes from the same tradition, drawing on the biblical. It comes from the same region. These three religions emerge in the same place and expand in the same place and engage from the very beginning with one another in that place. And some of the dynamics of power relations or prejudices are also shared, including the anti-Jewish dynamic. The difference is, of course, that with Muslims coming into Europe, they become a minority and experience the racism and Islamophobia in Europe in ways exclusionary, which some scholars now say we should hyphenate anti-Semitism in Europe to include anti-Arab, anti-Middle Eastern sentiments with the anti-Jewish sentiments as well. But in the rest of the world, I think I would think about the world that doesn't have the experience with Jews and Christianity and Islam in a direct way, and the world that does. So in the global South, for instance, Latin America has would be have a very different kind of idea. The legacy of the purity of blood, colonialism, then migration from Europe, a lot of both Jews but also non-Jews migrating to Argentina and Brazil. After the war, also a lot of German Nazis escaping to these countries, right? And creating, so that might be connected to that legacy of European anti-Semitism more broadly. I would also look at the dissemination of some of the anti-Semitic literature that emerges from Western Europe or Europe, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and other literature, the Blood Libels we were talking about, that gets exported from Europe and disseminated in the Middle East and other places. And then there is this whole world that is not affected too deeply. That is, there may have been Christian missionaries, colonial expansion, but that didn't penetrate into the religious tropes. So you could think about the Far East and India and other places. And here we have kind of interesting ways. Obviously, Jews lived in India for many ways and were integrated into that. And there may be some growing anti-Jewish, or again fueled by anti-Israeli sentiments. On the other hand, there are also connections between Jews and Israeli Jews going to India. And in Korea, for instance, I don't know much about it, but my colleague has written about it. There is this fascination with Jews as these very successful people. And it's what one might call philo-Semitic, but it also is a kind of form of exaggeration of Jewish success and their influence. And many people say, oh, we want to be like the Jews in that kind of way, right? Which is dangerous too. It kind of could be a little thin line to cross over, because some of the philo-Semitic ideas build on stereotypes of Jews that are anti-Jewish, right? Whether powerful or successful or wealthy or things of that sort.
Today, Muslim communities are frequently accused of being particularly anti-Semitic. While anti-Semitism certainly exists there, it is found across the political and religious spectrum in society. Do terms like Arabic anti-Semitism or Islamic anti-Semitism, often used in German media, make sense? Not as description of prevalence, but as specific original concepts of anti-Semitism? Or are there mostly inherited Christian tropes and motives within Islamic traditions?
That's a fantastic question you're asking. And I think, again, when we understand how anti-Semitism functions, not how it's defined, but how it functions, you can ask yourself whether that those ideas that some Muslims hold, as you said, that the antisemitism exists in among Muslims, whether it shares these tropes with the rest of how we understand anti-Semitism functions, or whether there are specific elements that differ it, right, from other forms of anti-Semitism that are prevalent in Europe or elsewhere. And there may be, but there may not be, right? So there may be specific motifs that are maybe not as prevalent among Christians, because they come from stories in the Hadith or in the Quran that are not part of the Christian heritage. But if it functions in the same way, then we shouldn't distinguish it, right? If the dynamic is the same. The same thing from the perspective here in the United States. We were talking with my students and my colleague when I was teaching a class on anti-Semitism and racism, whether there is such a thing as Black anti-Semitism, or is it simply a label that is anti-Semitism as expressed by Black individuals, but it's really nothing Black about it, nothing Muslim or Islamic about it, but it happens to be just expressed among Muslims or among Black people or among, but do we, is that this kind of white Christian default that we called anti-Semitism, and then we just label other things that we need to label because it represents groups that are not the dominant group which is, again, predominant white and Christian in Germany, European Christian in Germany. So that's the kind of thing that's where I would push back about. What is specific about? Is there something? And again, there might be some tropes that are emerging from the Islamic tradition that are being at play, but there might be tropes that are just part of the idea, right? With the Jews and power, Jews and money, and or the anti-Israel sentiments that might be similar to those on European left or other places, right? So that's what I would ask, like, investigate what people mean, and then ask oneself to investigate whether there might be some motifs that are specific to that group, and then we can say a motif that is unique to Muslims or such. So that's how I would approach it. So I wouldn't blanketly say that. I would push back against that blanket, Arab anti-Semitism, Muslim anti-Semitism. But I would try to nuance it in this way, to investigate whether there is anything different. And otherwise, I'd push back and say, well, this is how it functions. This is how it manifests. Is it the same as it functions and is manifested among others as well?
On the 27th of January, we commemorated the 80 years of liberation of Auschwitz. Would you understand the Holocaust mostly as a continuation and culmination of a long history of anti-Semitism? Or is there a moment of rupture or discontinuity, as Dan Diener suggested with his term Zivilisationsbruch? If yes, how could you describe the unprecedented rupture not only in scale but in quality?
So it is obviously a culmination of the gradual long history and of thinking about Jews first as inferior and with a sort of sense of contempt for Jews theologically and socially, and then in modern times in that sense of them being racially inferior and not undeserving to be in Europe among Europeans and needing to be excluded. But it also represents a rupture because it was eliminationist to the way that other earlier forms of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic even acts or attitudes were not. So before that, for instance, in the pre-modern period, Christians thought, okay, we don't like Jews, but we put them in their place in the lower hierarchy because they serve the function, the theological function, to show us that we're superior and show them that they rejected Jesus and they have this. Once they convert, they had they suddenly serve the kind of the triumph of Christianity. So they had a function, and they were, allowed to live among Christians, even if they may have been ghettoized. In the modern period, again, there was a response, the rejection of Jewish equality, and because Jews were racialized as Semitic and belonging to Palestine, there were all these points of like, let's just get rid of Jews to go to where they come from, right? They were perceived as coming from that place in that region in that way. So there was this, but there were no calls for a global genocide, for elimination of every single Jew on the face of the earth to solve the global problem, right? That's the difference, and that's a kind of redemptionist messianic messianic idea that the Nazis came with, right? They tallied how many Jews are where do they live, how many. I mean, in the Wannsee conference, right? There are specific numbers. They created the industrial complex. Now, the industrial complex, Germans tried in Namibia before. In the late 19th century, in the colonies, of creating that kind of. So there were kind of precedents, but there was no previously global idea of totally eliminating, murdering all Jews from the face of the earth. So that's the rupture. But the rupture comes from that ideology that sees Jews as not deserving to be where they are. And with the Nazi extreme, not deserving to live on earth.
Could you paint a picture of persecution looked like, especially in Eastern Europe during the rise of Zionism? Could you also elaborate on lesser known situations in place of like Poland or Romania in the 1930s?
So you mean the rise of Zionism in the late 19th century, why Zionism emerged? Okay. So the form of Zionism that is the date sort of given for the rise of Zionism, as you know from your previous conversations, is often seen as the Zionist Congress and Theodor Herzl and his Jewish state and the state of Jews, as I prefer to translate the Judenstaat rather than the Jüdische Staat, right, which would be Jewish state. Some of the impetus came earlier in Eastern Europe, and in Eastern Europe, it was provoked by this form of exclusionary violence of the pogroms in what is today Ukraine, but what was then the Russian Empire, and in 1880s, and some of the Jewish intellectuals who were very much into seeing Jews as being integrated into the Russian European society, saw it that this was a failure of that integrationist thing, that Jews needed to have a place on their own because they were not safe in Europe. Then Theodor Herzl in the West saw this exclusion of Jews and the virulent anti-Semitism that emerged at the end of the 19th century. He saw it obviously in Vienna, but he saw it also in Paris with the Dreyfus affair. And that's when he saw the failure, essentially, of liberal order in Europe. And he wanted Jews to have that country. He didn't care really where. He ended up supporting, again, what Europeans called Palestine at the time. But he wanted to recreate what Europe failed, the liberal democracy, right? That's why the Judenstaat, the state of Jews, rather than the Jüdische Staat, the Jewish state. He didn't see it as a Jewish state in that kind of way, but he saw it as a safe place for Jews, and he saw it as pluralistic, right? In that way. So both come as responses, different kind of ideas of what that meant but both come for responses to violence and exclusion from Jewish rights and inequality in Europe. So Zionism definitely emerges from that. Although again, there were what we could call perhaps proto-Zionist or Zionist ideas also in the Ottoman Empire, and sort of seeking autonomy region from within the Ottoman Empire. There were some intellectuals in Salonika and other places who were thinking of asking the Ottoman. So it's not entirely European. There were some intellectuals who were thinking about in those terms at the time, because the 19th century was an era of nationalism and people were reinventing and reimagining themselves. And the question of were Jews a nation, and if they are a nation, what do they are? It was really very, very important. In terms of the 1930s, so the part of Eastern Europe becomes part of the Soviet Union and is kind of excluded from that after 1921, 23. But then we have the rest of Europe, Eastern Europe, the nation states that emerge in the order after World War I. And we see, again, those debates about, for instance, in Poland, whether Poland is a multi-ethnic state or whether it's Poland for Poles only. And the legal framework of the minority rights. And that sort of sense that Jews are not part of those states. So then when in Poland things shift in 1935, and by that time Hitler is in power already for 2 years in Germany, and many of the right-wing nationalists in Poland draw from some of the ideas that come from Germany in that. So we have a very kind of pre-war spillover of exclusion and some policies against Jews that also spill over into Eastern Europe. And ultimately, we know from later also prepared ground for the ultimate murder of Jews. So the propaganda of anti-Bolshevism and all those things, exclusion from equality that we see in Germany as well. Although again, you were going back to the question of racism and anti-Semitism, some of the Nazi policies are actually based on anti-Black laws in the United States. Nazi legal scholars go to the United States to study laws of segregation, of anti-miscegenation, so against the sexual relations and intermarriage, and second-class citizenship, to apply it to Jews in Germany. So there's this sort of cross-pollination of these various policies.
Moving on, would you say Christian churches are doing enough to reckon with their part of spreading anti-Semitism historically?
For many, many decades. So Christian churches were not dealing with that until they were pushed after World War II, and the scope of what we now call the Holocaust, the Shoah, the murder of Jews became very clear, and some Christian theologians began to think like, what are the roots, and how is Christianity part of that story? For the Catholic Church, it took 2 decades to kind of begin to, not to begin, but to issue first open statements. 1965, the Declaration of Nostra Aetate was issued, which then opened up a new venue for Jews and Catholics to engage with one another. Some churches have not yet fully reckoned with it, and some of the debates over the 500-year anniversary of Luther's thesis came, right? Some Lutheran churches began to look at that. Some have already, but some have not. And now, of course, the more complicating factors, once again, Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where some liberal churches are feeling not, interested in addressing the question of anti-Semitism and questions of that tradition and that. So I think there is a lot to be done. And it's a process that needs to continue. We cannot just sort of sit, we've done it. We are, we've reckoned, because these things change and evolve. And as we see the geopolitical situation affecting how even we talk about the conflict as well. So I think we still, we need to do this kind of work, and yeah.
All right. So finally, the final question, what would you recommend to young people who want to understand the history of anti-Semitism? Could you suggest a book to start with?
That was the toughest question on your list, I have to say. Well, first of all, I don't know what's available in German, right? Second of all, I don't think there is a one book. There are a lot of books, and this is what is very interesting. There are a lot of books about the Holocaust, right? About the Shoah and the experiences. There are diaries, like Anne Frank diary. I'm sure everybody is reading it all around the world, and things of that sort. But that only takes us to this one moment in history, right? It doesn't necessarily tell us the sort of the longer story. So I was thinking about it, and I couldn't come up with a kind of a one book. And then I was frustrated what I told you about, that many of the books about anti-Semitism are about anti-Semites. So I'm not sure this is good for you guys to read how other people hated Jews and how they thought about that. So one thing that I would give you sort of like a guide, sort of like a guiding principle, is to read like historical fiction or some memoirs about Jews living in the 19th century, to capture short stories. I can like give examples of specific short stories or specific books that might be might be interesting in that way. But I think that would be and something that humanizes Jews and humanizes that experience. That might be better than a book about anti-Semitism that will. So that's where I would go. And again, I don't know how many are available in Germany. I could send you maybe a list of the stories and some books that might be interesting. And I'm not sure whether students are reading anymore. But reading historical fiction, reading memoirs to see the people how they are experiencing it, I think is far more effective than a book about anti-Semitism.
With that being said, we've come to the end of our podcast. I am truly thankful. We are thankful, incredibly so, and for your profound knowledge and the insights you shared with us today. And yes,
deeply appreciate your time.
Well, I'm really delighted. I want to thank you for being interested and for what you're doing. I think when I speak to students like you, I feel optimistic about the world. When I just look at the media, I feel very pessimistic about the world. So keep up the good work and speak to your friends and I hope you have an impact, and it was a real delight to talk with you. I hope you got out of the interview what you hope to get.
We did.
And I hope you and your listeners are leaving with some new thoughts. I always say we may disagree here and there, but I hope we all come out with new ways, new thoughts, and new way of thinking.
Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.